Next, we're going to be moving into chapter 16, but continue looking at chordates. So, after looking at amphibians and reptiles, next we're going to be looking at other groups that eventually include organisms like mammals. So, we'll begin with birds. Feathered birds and hairy mammals are among some of the most visible land dwelling vertebrates. If you try naming some, you can probably name a couple, like a crow, or an elephant, or a giraffe. But if we begin with birds, we can look at one of the first classes, class Aves, that is endothermic. They have a four-chambered heart, a toothless bill, are also oviparous, and use an amniotic egg. However, their amniotic egg is covered in a lime-containing shell. They're covered with feathers and also have an endoskeleton, but their bones are very porous and lightweight. But that's not a characteristic for all birds, but many. Now, birds are endothermic. That means they use a heat generating metabolic process to warm themselves internally. Cellular respiration is a process that generates a lot of heat and it keeps internal organs warm. Endothermy is oftentimes referred to as being warm blooded. Here's a quick comparison between endotherms and exotherms. A good example of an endotherm, a chipmunk. An ectotherm, an insect, a snail. Ectotherms are animals that need external energy to control body temperature. Think of a lizard basking. They're oftentimes considered cold-blooded. Whereas endotherms are animals that can control their own body temperature internally using metabolic processes and are oftentimes considered warm-blooded. Now, birds are the first organism we've looked at that has a truly four-chambered heart with a complete septum, two separate atria and two separate ventricles, atria being above the ventricles. And this allows for complete separation between both oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood, and we don't have to look at mixing between those two types of blood like we did for amphibians. The right side of the bird heart actually receives oxygen-poor blood that's coming back from tissues, then pumps it to the lungs for reoxygenation. The left side receives oxygen-rich blood from the lungs and then pumps it back to the tissues in order to redisseminate oxygen to those tissues. So let's take a quick look at some of the hearts we've essentially been introduced to. We looked at fish, which only have two chambers, one atrium and one ventricle. Fish also have a single cycle circulatory system, whereas amphibians, reptiles, except birds, and then mammals and birds all have a double circulation system. Amphibians have a three-chambered heart with no septum. Reptiles also have a three-chambered heart, but they have an incomplete septum, so we're starting to see the suggestion of separation between parts of the ventricle. But it's mammals and birds that have truly a four-chambered heart, with no fused ventricles and actual separation between what goes to the lungs and back to the heart and what goes to the tissues, then back to the heart, creating two separate circuits, a pulmonary and systemic circuit. Let's look more now at the toothless bill for a bird. The structure of a bird's bill is essentially based on the way in which it gathers its food, because birds' bills differ based on what they eat. Predatory birds, like eagles, have sharp, hooked bills designed for tearing meat. The flamingo has a long beak with sieves, and it essentially feeds by sucking water into the bill and then forcing it out through the sieves. Tiny shrimp and other small creatures get trapped in the bill, and the flamingo can eat them. Birds like a hummingbird feed on the nectar of flowers and have long, slender bills as a result. So we see for bird beaks or bills that the shape suits its function, or essentially the food source for the bird. We can also look at bird reproduction. They have internal fertilization. Development is oviparous because birds lay amniotic eggs outside the mother. But unlike the eggs of reptiles, bird eggs are not leathery. They don't have a leathery coating. They instead have a calcium containing compound inside their egg coating. This makes reptile eggs much softer, essentially, than bird eggs, but both shells are protective. We still have all four layers inside the amniotic egg for a bird, like we saw with the reptiles. We still, for example, have the overall covering called the chorion. We have the amnion. We have the albumen, the yolk sac, as well as the allantois. And keep in mind when you think about birds, you probably think about a bird's ability to fly. But not all birds can fly. But the three most important characteristics for flighted birds are feathers, wings, and skeletal structure. Whether or not they can fly, they do need feathers. Feathers grow from follicles. A feather has two basic parts, a shaft and a vein. The bare portion of the shaft that connects to the follicle, that's called the quill. And the portion of the shaft that holds the vein, that's called the rachis. The vein is composed of parallel barbs that originate at the rachis and extend outward. Two types of barbules, one smooth and one has hooks. And these barbules of the vein are arranged so that the hooked barbules grab on and slide along the smooth barbules, creating interlocking strands of the vein and giving the feather a lot of strength, but also making it flexible. Birds also produce oil from an oil gland near the base of their tail, and this oil lubricates the barbules of the vein, and the process of doing so is called preening. The oil spread during preening is usually waterproof, and it keeps the bird's wings from getting wet, and that helps keep the bird warm and not waterlogged. Waterlogged birds are too heavy to fly. So here is that basic structure for a feather. You can see down here we have the hollow shaft, we have some downy barbs, we have other parts of the vein leading to the hollow shaft, we have essentially the main rachis connected to the vein. You look close at the rachis, you can see that vein fibers come off of it. You can see that barb and barbule are separate. The central part of the vein from an initial branch is the barb. What comes off of it is the barbule, and the barbules have hooklets. And there are two types of feathers, contour and down feathers. Down feathers are going to have smooth barbules but no hooked barbules. Contour feathers have hooked and smooth barbules, and they allow for that interlock. Down feathers are generally more found underneath a layer of contour feathers. Contour feathers are on the wings of a bird, and they're essential for flight. Feathers are made of non-living tissue. They're like scales. As a result, birds have to molt. Usually this is done in pairs of feathers, but some waterfowl actually molt all at once, losing the ability to fly for a couple of weeks. Birds' wings are the key to their flight ability. They have feathers called alula. When a bird lands, the alula is lifted so that a gap exists between the wing and the alula, and both birds have a skeleton made up of porous light bones, and these light bones enable them to lift their weight with less metabolic effort, and that's pretty unique among mammals. So here let's look at their alula. So these are just parts of their wing that essentially are going to lift when in a certain position. They will not be lifted in other positions. When they lift, they allow for wind to get under them and allow for some of the pushing upward that allow birds to fly. Not sustained flight, but essentially initiating it. And we have a lot of different types of classifications within class Aves, so we're not going to go through every single one. For example, you have hawks in the falconiforms, you have the kingfishers in the choriciforms, woodpeckers are in the pisciforms, and even organisms like pelicans have their own order. So many different types, but we want to know kind of the basics, looking at how they fly, different types of feathers, their basic heart anatomy, and circulatory system. But the majority of the flightless birds are found in two orders, so we can look at them. The Struthioniforms and the Spheniciforms includes birds such as the ostrich, the penguin. They have a lot of the characteristics of birds that we've been looking at, they just don't fly. Penguins are graceful and powerful swimmers, ostriches are powerful runners, so they have other abilities. So here are some of those flightless birds. Penguins are one of the better aquatic birds, and they're great swimmers. And ostriches run extremely fast and have long, powerful skeletal muscles, as a result. If we look also at members of the order Falconiformes and Stringiformes, we can look at them collectively as birds of prey. Bald eagle, the owl, hawks, they're all examples of a bird of prey. They have keen eyesight, they spot their prey from up high, usually while in flight, but occasionally while perched. They swoop down, usually at speeds of up to 70 miles per hour, and grasp their prey with sharp talons. Occasionally, they will actually drop their prey then before swooping down to eat it. Looking at members of order Phoenicopteriformes, they are flamingos, and they do fly, but mostly they're seen standing in the water. The pink color comes from a diet of shrimp and cyanobacteria, and that's rich in carotenoids. The hummingbird is a generic name for hundreds of small birds that feed on nectar found in certain flowers, and they belong to order Aponidifores. They're known for the rapid rate in which they beat their wings, and only birds that have the ability to fly backwards exist in this order. Members of order Galliformes include quail. They're commonly types of birds that we call game birds and are cooked. They're actually composed primarily of flying muscles, and that's what we consider the white meat. Game birds are actually capable of only quick bursts of flying because their flying muscles contain little myoglobin, which would store oxygen. So they have poor oxygen storing capabilities and must rest their muscles often. Here are some examples of game birds, including chickens. Members of order Anseriformes are called swimming birds. Ducks, swans, geese, those are just some examples. And they produce the oil primarily used for preening, and we have seen, or you've probably seen, that particular trait if you've ever seen any of these waterfowl. And in the order Pelecaniformes, we see pelicans, albatross, and petrels. These are usually called diving birds. They dive into the water to catch their prey, and they use their bills instead of their talons to essentially allow for them to catch what they eat. Here are some diving birds in action. Sometimes they work in groups. Here is a wading bird, like a heron, in order Chyconiformes. They wade in water, look for small fish and other aquatic organisms to eat. Here's order Passeriformes. These consist of songbirds, and all birds have the ability to make a chirping sound because they have a special organ called the syrinx. Members of this order, though, essentially things like sparrows and nightingales also included, they tend to have the most well-developed syringes that are capable of making really beautiful sounds, and that's what we associate with a lot of birds. And songbirds have beautiful and varying noises they can produce, and I would recommend you go online and find a YouTube video to see some of the variation. So here is one songbird, and I won't play the video in this presentation, but we can do so on Friday. And next we're going to be looking at class Mammalia in more detail. This is essentially a subphylum of vertebrata. Mammals occupy virtually every ecosystem with which people are familiar. If I asked you to list animals, you'd probably start listing mammals. But in reality, the term really only includes creatures like, or excludes, I should say, creatures like sponges and hydra, fishes, amphibians, reptiles, and birds. Most organisms that we might consider mammals are actually going to be a part of a different phyla. Basic characteristics of mammals include hair covering the skin, reproduction with internal fertilization. They're usually viviparous. They nourish their young with milk secreted by mammary glands. They're endothermic, and they have a heart with 4 chambers. Hair on mammals is a characteristic that makes them distinct. It's made of non-living cells, and these cells are produced by hair follicles. And many mammals have 2 types of hair, underhair and guard hair. Underhair is found under the guard hair, and guard hair is coarser than underhair. Guard hair tends to be longer as well. The hair we see when we look at mammals, typically guard hair. And guard hair is the hair that give mammals their color, their distinctive markings. Underhair insulates them, though, and keeps mammals warm. There's other uses for hair. Occasionally the hair is modified. A porcupine's guard hair is stiff and pointy, and it actually can be used for defense. The whiskers of a cat are sensitive to touch, and they are representative of guard hair. And in some mammals, guard hairs bristle as a response to touch or as a threat. Here's an example of ovirhairs, guard hairs, and underhairs. Not all organisms have ovirhairs, but a woolly mammoth does, even though they're extinct. Here we can see some of the variations that are found in mammals. Some are aquatic, some are terrestrial, some live both on land and in the water. But here we're looking at an otter that also does have guard hair and underhairs. Underhairs have a surface texture that helps the hair knit together, and that makes an insulating layer that keeps hair warm next to the skin. And their guard hairs are more smooth and waterproof and prevent cold water from reaching the dense, fluffy undercoat that's keeping them warm. Reproduction in mammals is internal and viviparous. There are exceptions, but these animals are called non-placental mammals. So our main focus here is placental mammals. Placental mammals have young that develop viviparously. A placenta is a structure that allows an embryo to be nourished with the mother's blood supply. The mother's blood brings oxygen and nutrients to the placenta, which allows the embryo's blood vessel to absorb them. The embryo's waste then travel to the mother's blood for excretion through her excretory system. As the offspring develops inside the mother, we say it is in gestation. Gestation is the period of time during which the embryo develops before being born. Continuing to look at reproduction in mammals, we can talk more about gestation time. It varies greatly. Mice have a gestation period, for example, of only 3 weeks. Horses have a gestation period of almost 1 full year. The practical result of long gestation, though, is the offspring is much more developed when it's born. Mice are born hairless, blind, and weak, but horses are born with a full coat of hair and can stand, walk, and even run within hours of their birth. And mammals tend to care for their young. They provide milk to nourish the young, produced by mammary glands, and the mammary glands in female mammals are always present but tend to only produce milk shortly before a period of time after birth. When a female mammal's mammary glands are active, we say the female is lactating. And most mammals have some sort of family structure in which the parents teach the young survival skills before the young leave the protection of the parents. Here are just some average gestation periods for different mammals. You can compare the size of the organisms and their gestation periods. For example, again, a rat only has a 21-day gestation period, a chicken 22, dog 53 to 71 days, horse 329 to 345 days with an average of 336, whale up to 547 days, and an elephant at average 624 days. Mammals, again, are not only endothermic, but they have a four-chambered heart. They're able to regulate their own body temperature and keep it constant and use essentially a double pump system and keep oxygenated and deoxygenated blood separate. And the members of class Mammalia are divided into many orders, but only 3 groups: the monotremes, marsupials, and placental mammals. Monotremes include things like the duck-billed platypus, marsupials, things like the kangaroo, and the placental mammals are probably most that you would name, like a giraffe and an elephant. About 4,500 species actually exist in the placental mammal group. Only about 300 species in the marsupial group, and only 5 species survive the platypus, and then 4 species of spiny animals called echidnas in the monotreme group. Monotremes are the only mammal that lay eggs. Monotremes, you can see here up top an echidna, down at the bottom a duck-billed platypus, only mammal not viviparous. Instead, they're oviparous, and they lay eggs and attend to them like birds do. They do nourish their young with milk once they hatch. Then both animals that you see here live in Australia and surrounding islands. Marsupials are things like kangaroos, koalas, and possums. They have a phase of development that is pretty short for their developing offspring, and no placenta is formed. Instead, after a few days, immature offspring crawl into its mother's pouch, which contains nipples. It attaches itself to a nipple and continues to develop in the pouch. And most marsupials also live in Australia. So the United States has a marsupial, the possum. So here are just some examples of marsupials. You can see, for example, the possum right up here in the middle. And then placental mammals are essentially the biggest group of mammals. There are more than 4,200 known species of placental mammal. Thus far, there are way more than monotremes and marsupials combined, and they're found all over the world. Members of order Chiroptera, for example, are the only flying mammals. They include things like the bat. Bat look like mice with wings. They live in dark environments, caves, barns, and forests, and they use sound waves that bounce off other creatures in order to provide information to itself about its environment. So they can essentially see in the dark using its unique sonar system. The system's really efficient. It essentially allows a bat to determine the precise location of a fruit fly from as far as 100 feet away. Members of order Carnivora in the placental mammals include cats, dogs, and other mammals that eat meat. These mammals have really distinctive teeth. They have canine fangs. Their feet typically have claws. They use them to catch prey. And they also have behaviors that allow them to catch prey, like stealth, traveling in packs. And a lot of these organisms may not only eat meat, but tend to eat it primarily. But bears, for example, can also eat plants, berries, and honey. But all members of order Carnivora eat some meat, but again, not necessarily only meat. Here we can see the skull of a carnivore. You can see at the front they have very pointy incisors. Aquatic mammals, typically in the placental mammal group, belong to the order Sirenia or Cetacea, and all members of these orders breathe with lungs, and therefore, even though they're aquatic, they have to come up to the surface to breathe. It includes organisms like whales and dolphins. They have blowholes on the top of their heads through which they can surface to breathe. Order Cetacea actually contains the largest known mammal, the blue whale, and that can reach weights of 170 tons and lengths of 110 feet. Luckily, it's a giant creature that feeds on plankton in the water. And dolphins and porpoises navigate with sonar, kind of similar to bats. And if you want to know the difference between essentially a dolphin and a porpoise, we can look here. A dolphin actually has pointed teeth, a pointed snout, and usually a hooked or curved top fin. The top fin for a porpoise usually has more of a triangle shape, and they have a rounded snout, and they have rounded teeth. Here we can see the comparison of the size of a blue whale compared to a human. They are the largest known aquatic mammal. And there's various other orders for mammals. Order Proboscidea contains elephants. Perissodactyla and Artiodactyla contain hoofed mammals. And Order Rodentia contains squirrels, rats, mice, porcupine, and prairie dogs. It actually has the largest number of species, include gnawing animals and have incisors that grow their entire life. Here are some hoofed animals, like the rhinoceros, the zebra. They are occasionally considered related to ungulates, which are ancestral hoofed organisms. And there are even-toed and odd-toed hoofed ungulates. For example, an even-toed hoofed ungulate would be something like a bison or an elephant. Here are some organisms from the order Rodentia. Again, squirrels, capybara, beaver. And order Lagomorpha includes rabbits and hares, and they are rodent-like. And lagomorphs have a second pair of peg-like incisors on their upper jaws that rodents don't have, so that kind of separates them. The offspring of rabbits are born with no hair and their eyes are still closed, whereas the offspring of hares are born covered in fur and their eyes are open. So just mild separation there, and hares generally have longer ears and are larger than rabbits. You can see the hare on the right and the rabbit on the left. Order Edentata contain creatures such as an anteater that eats ants, termites, essentially using its long tongue. It walks on its knuckles, it uses claws for defense, tends to live in forests or swampy areas, avoids really highly populated regions, in areas with diverse animal life. It has a long snout, tubular mouth, and a long tongue, but no teeth. It's usually mistaken for an ant eater, but those in order Tubulidentata are aardvarks. They also eat ants and termites and have a long mouth and tongue. So they are similar to anteaters, but they have teeth, whereas anteaters do not. So you see the aardvark on the left and the anteater on the right for the image on the left. You can see the long tongue for the anteater on the right. And anteaters don't have teeth. And then last but not least, we're looking at order Insectivora. And it includes shrews, moles, and hedgehogs. And these are creatures with pointed snouts, and they're called Insectivora in the Mammalia phyla because they burrow for insects. Similar to primates, which are monkeys, apes, lemurs, and humans, these animals are sometimes considered erect mammals because they can walk on two legs. All primates generally have good depth perception, larger brains compared to their body size. Are omnivorous, there are some exceptions. They have nails on their fingers and toes, generally anywhere from 4 to 5 fingers on each hand and 5 toes on each foot. There is an exception in the spider monkey. They usually have opposable thumbs. They have a longer gestation period, especially for their size, and they're generally pretty social. Scientists actually study animal behavior, especially that is social, through observation and experiments. Animal behavior is a response that an animal makes to changes in its environment. Animal behavior can be classified in two main categories: innate or learned behavior. Innate behavior is sometimes called an instinct or reflex. It's essentially something we consider inherited. It's performed correctly by all members of a species without any previous experience needed. Burrowing, digging, any type of den behavior, that's considered innate. For example, the bird called a blue tit would peel bark from trees with their beaks in search for food and don't really have to be taught that. They can learn to use this capacity, though, to pierce bottles and siphon cream from within the bottles. So innate traits can be fashioned for other uses. We think this is related to essentially a fixed action pattern, or essentially the possibility of complex innate behavior developing or being triggered by a stimulus in all animals that possess this behavior. It essentially would occur at an unchangeable or as an unchangeable sequence of actions that have to continue until completed. An example we've seen that we would consider a fixed action pattern is egg retrieval from the gray leg goose. There's also some arrhythmic patterns of behavior that we see, like internal clock use that keeps activity and rest essentially on a 24-hour cycle. This is sometimes called the circadian rhythm. And rhythmic behaviors are essentially anything that is regularly repeated, such as wakefulness and sleep. And migration is also considered a rhythmic pattern. Whereas instead of an innate behavior, a learned behavior is a change in behavior resulting from experience that is not inherited. Three main types of learned behavior exist: habituation, imprinting, and conditioning. Habituation is a learned process in which an animal learns not to respond to repeated stimulus that conveys little or no important information. Imprinting is a usually irreversible type of limited learning limited to a specific time period in an animal's life, and this time period is called the critical or sensitive learning period. For example, baby geese tend to imprint on the first adult they see. Generally, this is irreversible, whereas conditioning is a type of learning in which a stimulus or response is linked to a reward or punishment. There's both classical and operant conditioning, depending on how exactly the conditioning begins. Classical conditioning is when an animal learns to associate an unrelated stimulus to an already established stimulus, whereas operant conditioning is a trial and error process of learning that involves the animal learning a behavior in response to rewards or punishments. So here's an example of habituation and imprinting. We have crows present in a cornfield. They introduce a scarecrow. They at first are scared of the scarecrow, but over time realize by trial and error that there's actually no punishment. And so prolonged exposure to the scarecrow can actually cause them to essentially become used to it. Here's conditioning. We have a dog seeing meat, and that's causing salivation. Now, when we show them meat, we're going to ring a bell, and they're still going to salivate. But what we've done now is associate a sound with salivation. Over time, we'll continue the middle situation and eventually be able to just produce the sound and hopefully cause salivation. If we can do so, that's a type of conditioning. And social behaviors often take the form of competitive behaviors, courtship behaviors, or cooperation. All social behaviors are a method of communication. Aggressive behavior, territorial behavior, dominance, hierarchies, these are all examples of competitive behavior. Scientists actually hypothesize that dominance hierarchies allow animals to spend more time and energy finding food and raising young. That way, they no longer have to worry about fighting for position within the group. Whereas courtship behaviors are usually visual displays, sounds, or chemical stimuli to attract a mate, and they usually involve a combination of innate and learned behavior. But cooperation is required for running a more complex hierarchy or group. For example, think of a hive of bees. We can also think of hunting large prey in packs and protecting a community young. So social behaviors definitely vary. Some aggressive, some useful to a community, and some more complex than others. And that is kind of our basic look at mammals, as well as some of the other types of vertebrates. And that's it for our chapters.